plaintiff over here representing the HLacks family. We have the defendant here representing Johns Hopkins University. Please take a seat.
The 1950s was an eventful decade, filled with the baby boom, the suburban boom, but it was also a decade filled with blatant sexism and racism. Just to give you a little background, in this decade, 1955, Rosa Parks was arrested. The Jim Crow laws were also alive and well to enforce racial segregation. During this time, Johns Hopkins was one of the few hospitals that took any gender, race, or financial status as a basis of treatment. As you'll find out today, this severely affected the well-being of my client, HLacks. HLacks went to Johns Hopkins for a mysterious bump on her cervix and was diagnosed with cancer. Here is a picture of her and her husband, the woman behind the notorious HeLa cells. What you will find out today is that during her time with Johns Hopkins, she was misdiagnosed and mistreated. She had already been through a rough childhood filled with a lack of education and poverty, and had her first child when she was only 14 years old. Henrietta was also Black, so she struggled with the same racism that Rosa Parks was dealing with. Today, you will hear the story of how Henrietta went for Johns Hopkins for treatment, how it didn't work, and she was left for dead. Johns Hopkins still takes her cells and distributes them, making millions of dollars today. While the HLacks family is left in poverty, not even able to afford health insurance. All Henrietta wanted was to get proper treatment and to live. Good morning, my name is Claudia Gahn, and this is my team. We represent the HLacks family, who experienced nothing less but the bitter suffering at the expense of Johns Hopkins as well. We are here to address the invasion of privacy and theft that Johns Hopkins performed on my client and their late family member, Henrietta HLacks, a wife, mother, and friend. What we want is financial compensation to make up for the suffering that Johns Hopkins has cost the HLacks family. Although money will never make up for what happened to their dear Henrietta. Henrietta was diagnosed with cervical cancer. And then she went to Johns Hopkins for treatment. Now, when you are diagnosed with cancer, doctors will distinguish the type of tumor that the patient is afflicted by. Johns Hopkins doctors at first misdiagnosed Henrietta's tumor, saying that she had an invasive epidermoid carcinoma of the cervix, when in fact she had an aggressive invasive adenocarcinoma of the cervix. This was already a bad start for how Henrietta was treated at Johns Hopkins, but it gets worse. In treatment, Henrietta also received too much radium, which contributed to her early death at only 31 years old. The radium caused her body to have burns all over, which affected the well-being of my client and caused the unnecessary pain and hardship of her life. Now, in addition to the actions of Johns Hopkins Hospital increasing the detriment of Henrietta's health, but it also affected her family's health. Later on, Deborah HLacks, her daughter, suffered from high blood pressure and cholesterol, as well as many other cardiothoracic conditions, complications, and issues that can be attributed mainly to stress. Now, what is the cause of this stress? Johns Hopkins and how they treated her mother, Henrietta. Johns Hopkins also caused some of the anger issues that Henrietta's son, Zachariah, suffered from. So not only did Johns Hopkins invade her privacy and steal and sell her cells, but when they had her cells, they still misdiagnosed her and mistreated her. Maybe if Henrietta had gone to a different hospital, she would have had an extra 10 to 20 years to spend time with her husband and 5 children. down to the actual retrieval of her cells. When Henrietta was beginning her treatment, Dr. Talindi asked Dr. George Guy, who was directly affiliated with Johns Hopkins, to take some of Henrietta's cells. For the record, Dr. Guy has described himself as, and I quote, the world's most famous vulture feeding on human specimens constantly. So Guy, and by connection Johns Hopkins Hospital, treated Henrietta like another animal to be preyed upon, rather than a human being and patient that was seeking proper medical treatment. When Henrietta's cells were first removed, they were sent to Dr. Guy's assistant, Mary Kubitschek. Because of Johns Hopkins' protocol, they were also labeled black to avoid any contamination with the white people's cells. As you will see in written accounts today, Mary was originally not even going to look at Henrietta's cells. She thought that they would be dead before she would get around to it. Now, perhaps she was avoiding them because she knew that they were black. Henrietta also gave her permission for her cells to be removed for a sample. However, neither Henrietta nor her family gave permission to Johns Hopkins for her cells to be sold like candy to scientists and researchers all over the world. Johns Hopkins also failed to give informed consent to Henrietta. Informed consent allows her patients to know what is happening to them, and so that they can tell the doctors and people treating them that they know what's happening and that they're okay with everything that's going on. However, Henrietta did not fully understand what was going on. The doctors of Johns Hopkins failed to attempt to explain anything to her. Was this also because she was black? For example, on her medical record, you will see that the Johns Hopkins doctors said that Henrietta was failed to be informed before one of her procedures and which she would become sterile from. This means that she would not be able to have any children afterwards. Once Henrietta found out after the surgery that she would be left infertile, she said that if she had known that this would happen, she would never have gone through with it. And Henrietta's family still today does not fully understand what happened to Henrietta throughout her experience at Johns Hopkins. Now, Henrietta's death was tragic and horrible to almost everyone who knew her. Even her doctor, Mary Kubitschek, who, by the way, didn't seem to make any emotional connection to the woman whose cells she had been working with until then during the autopsy. To the doctors and researchers, it was seen as just another chance to take more cells from my client Henrietta's own body. Now, it is not legal to take cells away from a dead person. However, Day, Henrietta's husband, had eventually signed the consent forms in order to retrieve the cells from her body. But Johns Hopkins had already taken Henrietta's cells before they had received the consent forms from her husband. Now, we understand that a lot of this can never be changed. We can go back in time and tell Henrietta to go to a different hospital or to explain to her exactly what was happening. We can't undo the unfair distribution of Henrietta's body, is help out the HLacks family by having Johns Hopkins give a small fraction of the millions of dollars made on Henrietta's cells to her family. Money Johns Hopkins won't even notice is gone. And wouldn't that be something Henrietta would have wanted for her family? Wouldn't it have been important to her that her family is taken care of and can afford things as simple as health insurance? Johns Hopkins should be ashamed of their actions. And because Henrietta was a poor black woman, she seemed like an easy target to them. And because being poor, being female, being black, they didn't give her the same care as they would have if she were wealthy, white, and male. The defense will tell you that this invasion of privacy and theft of her cervical cells was for a good cause or something along those lines. But what they won't tell you is that Henrietta was scared and alone within the white walls of that hospital. If it's a good cause, then why not do the noble thing and give her family a portion of that money that they made off of her mother's body? All Henrietta wanted was to live to see her grandchildren be born, or to go visit her daughter Elsie before she died. But because of Johns Hopkins and their actions, Those opportunities were robbed from her, and that can never be fixed. Thank you.
On January 29, 1951, Henrietta Lacks and her husband pulled up to Johns Hopkins Hospital. For a year, Henrietta had been feeling pain and a knot in her cervix. Sure enough, Dr. Howard Jones felt this knot, took a sample for the hospital's pathologist, and sent Henrietta home. She returned 3 months later with a full-fledged tumor. The doctor said this tumor had grown at a horrifying rate. She learned that she had an epidermoid carcinoma of the cervix, stage 1, which we would find out later that was a misdiagnosis, an honest mistake on the doctor's part. She was treated with radium, which was discovered in the late 1800s. Meanwhile, Dr. George Guy, head of tissue culture research at Hopkins, was searching for an immortal line of malignant cells to perform research on and hopefully find a cure for cancer. So when Dr. Richard Toland, cervical cancer expert, offered Guy samples of cervical cancer tissues to try to grow, he accepted. One of those samples came from Henrietta, taken by Toland during her first radium treatment. George's assistant, Mary Kubitschek, found that these cells were immortal, meaning they continuously underwent mitosis even after they are out of her cervix. When she realized this, he started shipping samples all around the world, at first for free, later with a fee. All this went on without the family's knowledge until 1973. George Guy met his ironic end to pancreatic cancer in 1970. Henrietta's tumor kept spreading, and even while being treated with radium, to the point to where her urinary tract was blocked by tumors, and she could not urinate. Henrietta Lacks, better known to the world as HLa, died October 4, 1951. Her official cause of death, as stated on her death certificate, was uremia, caught on by carcinoma of the cervix. We are representing Johns Hopkins, a hospital being sued by the family of Henrietta Lacks for taking samples of her mother's cancerous tissue without consulting the family before and after her death. When, however, Henrietta Lacks did indeed sign a consent form that stated the following: I hereby consent to the staff of the Johns Hopkins Hospital to perform any operative procedures and under any anesthetic, either local or general, that they may deem necessary in the proper surgical care and treatment of Henrietta Lacks.
In the 65 years since Dr. George Guy took her cells, attitudes of bioethics as well as laws have changed. For example, informed consent for patients didn't become a requirement until 1957, although Henrietta's doctor did have to sign the consent form just in case. This gave Johns Hopkins Hospital permission to do any surgical care that they deemed necessary in care of Henrietta Lacks. David Lacks, her husband, gave permission for the autopsy as well as the doctors to run tests to help solve for future discoveries in her children's health. During the time when Henrietta Lacks' cells were taken, with consent after when her cells were sold, there had been much debate over the ownership and possession of bodily tissues that had been taken surgically removed. It was accepted by many court systems and the Columbia University Law School that surgically removed tissues did not grant the ownership or possession to the original patient. Since the tissue that was removed with consent was no longer in Henrietta's ownership or possession, Johns Hopkins has full authority and rights to use the cells to assist in the advancement of biomedical advancements. In a very similar case, John Moore versus the Regents of the University of California, brain cells have been patented and sold for millions of dollars in profit. The Supreme Court rejected Moore's suit as it was deemed that Moore did not have a property interest in the cell line developed by his doctor, and as rights and privacy and dignity were sufficiently protected by the doctrine of informed consent. The first witness that we would like to call to the stand is Mary Kubitschek, who will testify that Henrietta's identity, dignity was sufficiently protected because even her, the researcher who performed the growing of cells in her lab, did not know it was actually Henrietta, and through the informed consent that Henrietta signed. The next witness is Malcolm Lucas, the chief judge of the Moore versus Regents of the University of California, who will explain his and his assistant judges leading up to the final verdict, determining the ownership of the removed tissue from HLacks, who will testify that he did in fact sign the consent form to allow the doctors to do the autopsy on Henrietta Lacks after she had passed. Our next witness is Dr. Richard Talind, who will testify that he removed the tissue from Henrietta Lacks in the autopsy and during the first rate treatment and gave them to Dr. George Guy. Our final and last witness is Dr. Jones, who will testify that he did diagnose Henrietta Lacks based on his sole professional opinion, and the misdiagnosis was not based on sexism or any racist grounds.
We realize that these cells are one of the only traces of Henrietta Lacks left in the world, and her family doesn't want them to be shipped around the world experimented on less than. But they have to think of the great revolution these cells have brought on in the science field. Ceasing the study of these cells could prohibit finding a cure for cancer. With the cells, scientists have found a vaccine for polio and made great breakthroughs in the study of cancer, leukemia, HIV/AIDS, and genetic diseases. Scientists also learned how to map out chromosomes in the nucleus of the cell, all due to the immense amount of research and effort put in by the scientists and researchers. The other thing that the Lacks family wants is money. They may think the scientists are getting rich off the research, but in fact, those scientists are using the money to continue the research. Hospitals don't run on dreams. We need something to pay for the research. It could potentially help millions of people. This case has two outcomes. We can stop all research and pay the Lacks family for not doing anything, which goes against this society's traditional capitalist ideas. Or we can drop it and continue the research that could change lives forever.
The defense is talking about regarding Henrietta's consent reads, I hereby give consent to the staff of Johns Hopkins Hospital to perform any operative procedures and under any anesthetic, either local or general, that may deem necessary in the proper surgical care and treatment of Henrietta Lacks. Now, I don't think that removing cells is surgical care.
Objection, that's an opinion.
Tell me more.
Well, she said an opinion.
Your Honor, I'm stating the facts.
So why did you say I don't think?
Because I'm stating a fact of law. Removing cells is not surgical care. And that's a fact. And Henrietta Lacks was all left in the dark while this was happening. She didn't know what she had consented to, which apparently was the distribution of her body. And the Lacks family, to clarify, does not want to stop testing. We realize that the use of Henrietta cells has progressed the scientific research world in cancer and the curing of diseases. What we want is financial compensation. A small fraction of the money that Johns Hopkins has made millions of dollars off of. Henry Lacks' husband, Day, did give permission for Henrietta's cells to be removed during the autopsy, but this was after her cells had already been removed. They had took her cells already without getting any permission from her family beforehand. So what we want is justice for Henrietta and her family. We want the Lacks family to be able to have the same opportunities that the doctors at Johns Hopkins have had from their millions of dollars that they've made off of Henrietta. We just want to give the Lacks family a chance to participate in the large sums of money that all came from Henrietta. We want to give Henrietta and her family the justice that they deserve.
Through some very minor research, you can find that taking tissue from a patient is not illegal.
Objection, that's not from the 1950s. That's regarding now's law. That's a misstatement of law.
I'm sorry?
That's a misstatement of law. You're regarding the invasion. You're regarding the restrictions on procedures for effecting bodily intrusions as of the 2000s instead of the 1950s when this happened.
So, anyone here who's been to a hospital, who has gotten blood drawn, tested, or had any medical procedure that ended in ectomy, that tissue is stored somewhere in a hospital, just sitting there. Not being tested on, just sitting there. So is every American that has ever gone to a hospital to get some sort of tissue removed going to sue the hospital just for keeping it? No, there would be no use in that. I want to draw your attention to the case that we previously talked about, the John Moore case. This is the same sort of idea that happened in this case. He got his spleen out, and then he realized they were testing on his cells. But the Supreme Court of the United States rejected it because he had no ownership over those cells, even if he didn't know what's going on. The plaintiff has stated that Johns Hopkins is getting rich off this research. This is not true. You need money to continue research. They're using the money they're making they're putting it into they're not just keeping it into their own pockets. Dr. George Guy, the one who initially started selling.
Objection. What is your evidence that they are not using some of it to go into the pockets of the
I was
doctors?
getting there.
Okay.
Objection.
Dr. George Guy, as I was about to say, was not rich. You can find that in any kind of research that you do. He used that money to do something that he had been trying to do for years before Henrietta came along. All he wanted to do was find a cure for cancer. He wasn't trying to get rich off of some woman.